Mostly I want to offer a few reflections on notions that play a central part in this project, the notions of myth and religion and secularization. The project, as you know, is called The Return of Religion and Other Myths. This session is dedicated to myths of religion and secularization. So how do we use these terms? How do we understand them? Myths of religion as secularization and vice versa. Now, a lot of people asked us, what exactly does this title, The Return of Religion and Other Myths, mean? What is supposed to, what is supposed to be the myth? Is it the return that's the myth, or is it religion itself that's the myth? And actually, we didn't anticipate this. For us, it was quite clear that it was the return that's the alleged, or that's the myth. To us, it was quite surprising that many people thought that we were saying that religion itself is a myth. Perhaps we should have taken, or we should have used or stolen Kenan Malik's title with a bit more precision, because in his version, in the title of his lecture, he has this little dash which at least suggests that, or at least stimulates the interpretation that it is the return that's the myth, although you could still read it in the other way as well. To me, these questions are quite interesting. I mean, they show that we didn't think things through, that's one thing, but they also point to a genuine problem, to the status of these terms and a problem in their interrelation. So what is myth in relation to religion, and what is myth in relation to secularization? Going back in history a bit, the term myth and the term mythology became incredibly important in European culture in the early 19th century, in early Romanticism. There were texts talking about a possible new mythology in response to the Enlightenment and its perceived secularization and disenchantment of the world. So there was a perceived lack. The world had been demythologized, and the question was if there could be some form of re-mythologization. To some extent in the 19th century, this term myth came to function as a substitute for the term idolatry. Christian discourse on other religions had of course always been focused on the notion of idolatry, of the worship of idols, of false gods. But as Christianity was criticized in the Enlightenment, it became increasingly problematic for authors who didn't necessarily identify themselves as Christians anymore to continue using this term, which was so intimately associated with religious discourse, with Christianity, and of course with Judaism. So another term was needed to conceptualize religious practices that were different from one's own ideas and one's own practices. And the old Greek term mythos, referring to a certain mode of speech, a certain type of discourse that came to be seen as opposed to logos, to rational discourse, served this function as a quasi-substitute for the notion of idolatry. So idolatry, being identified with religious discourse, was increasingly suspect for post-Christian authors who then used the terms mythology and myth as handy substitutes to discuss mainly old pre-Christian but also non-Western religious practices and beliefs. So myth is a form of speech. It is a type of discourse. It has narrative qualities. Myths, to give a really basic definition, are stories about gods and heroes. But these narratives were also seen as being rather visual in nature, or at least the language of myth was seen as a visual type of language. Nietzsche talks about die Bilder des Mythos, the images of myth. So we are talking about a type of language that uses poetic imagery. So already we see that this discourse of myth, being primarily about narrative, isn't completely opposed to the discourse about idolatry, which focused, of course, as we all know, on the visual aspects of religious practice, on cult images, on graven images, on idols. Conversely, the discourse on idolatry wasn't completely free from narrative aspects. After all, idolatry was always conceived in terms that involved a before and an after. Idols are there to be smashed or destroyed, or at least to be somehow diffused. Idolatry is there to be overcome. So idolatry is always part of a narrative of its overcoming and of the emergence and the establishment of true religion. So in both cases there is quite a complex relationship between the narrative and the visual, both in the case of the discourse on idolatry and that on mythology or myth. Now, myths of religion and of secularization. Here we have a rather interesting image from an atheist website. Imagine no religion. So a post-religious state is being imagined with an extremely suggestive image. The Twin Towers, which were of course destroyed by monotheistic Islamic fundamentalism. So in a nutshell, in a visual nutshell if we will, we have a mythical image of a desired post-religious state. So we see that the visual and the narrative again interact in highly complex and interesting ways. Christianity, of course, always conceived of itself as a post-mythical religion at the same time as a post-idolatrous religion. One of the great, perhaps the last great Catholic philosopher, Schelling, in the mid-19th century, developed an incredible theory of mythology in which the entire history of myth, of various myths from various cultures, in the end culminated in Christianity, or rather they prepared the way for the revelation of truth in Christianity. So there you have this entire history of myth slowly preparing mankind for the acceptance of revealed truth, which shatters this whole fabric of myth and at the same time its culmination. This opposition between true revealed religion and myth was already questioned not only already in the late 18th century, but even more forcefully in the early 19th century by authors such as David Friedrich Strauss, about whom Nietzsche wrote one of his unzeitgemäße Betrachtungen later on. Strauss applied what he called the mythical method to the Gospels, to the biblical text, to the revealed Word of God, and he discovered mythical motifs in this text. So, for instance, some episode from the life of Christ could be uncannily similar to stories about other gods or heroes. So apparently this wasn't just historical truth. Apparently all kinds of mythical elements were woven into this text. So Christianity itself came to be seen as being studded with myth. This generalization of the concept of myth became ever more pronounced in the later 19th and 20th centuries. So not only was the biblical text revealed to be infiltrated by myth, but myth increasingly came to be seen as a type of discourse that could infiltrate just about anything. Myth came to be seen as a disease of language. Anything could be mythical. And from this perspective, it doesn't so much matter if something is factually true or not. The question is rather, how does it function? So for instance, a battle may well have occurred historically, but at the same time people, groups, countries can use this historical battle in such a way that it comes to function as a founding myth. As the contemporary author Jan Assmann, who will also appear in our series later on, puts it, history is transformed into myth as soon as it is remembered, narrated, and inhabited. That is to say, as soon as it is woven into the fabric of the present. Just two examples of how this may function. On the right, you see a cover page, front page of Der Spiegel, Die Geburt der Deutschen, a cover story from late last year on the famous Hermannsschlacht, the battle in the year 8 AD of Germanic tribes led by Hermann der Cherusker against the Roman army. And this battle apparently happened historically, but at the same time in the 19th century it became a myth that functioned within the context of German nationalism and German reunification. And of course, to talk about this event in the year 8 AD as Die Geburt der Deutschen in the year 2008 is profoundly mythical. And just as a little aside, in the week before that, Der Spiegel had a cover story on Abraham, Christen, Juden, Muslime, wem gehört der Urvater der Religionen? So Der Spiegel obviously covering all the topical stories of the year 2008. So myth and secularization. Surely secularization, the secular, is opposed to both religion and to myth, one would imagine. But we've already seen, or have already argued, that myth, according to modern theories of myth, can infiltrate pretty much anything. And modern sociologists, theorists, philosophers have paid great attention on mythical aspects of apparently secular discourse, but also secular institutions. They've also paid great attention to the infiltration of sacred aspects in apparently secular institution. So myth may well come to function in an apparently secular context, in a secular society, and this also suggests that the sacred hasn't somehow been left behind. The sacred isn't the sole property of religions. From Emil Durkheim on, countless authors have traced sacred aspects in seemingly secular institutions. Following that, various Marxist authors, including Walter Benjamin, have also analyzed capitalism as being religious or sacred in nature. Walter Benjamin wrote a note on capitalism as religion, and recently the artist Paul Chan, basing himself on Benjamin among others, argued that secularization has not separated and freed us from divine authority, but has instead retooled it. It left its authority intact and simply moved it from one place to another, displacing a heavenly hierarchy onto an earthly one. Grace becomes redefined as progress, and sacrifice is elevated to a divine right. In our modern transfiguration, every exchange is an unwitting prayer for the continuance of the economic miracle. It hasn't quite worked. We now realize this continuance hasn't really happened, but capitalism is a cruel god, as we will find out in a few moments in a little lecture by the great cultural critic Stephen Colbert, which I'll show you. Since the 1960s, on the left side you see this famous cover story by Time magazine from 1966, I believe. Since the 1960s, the discourse on the status of religion in modern society has changed rather radically. In the 1960s, religion seemed to be on the decline, or it was on the decline, and many thought that this decline was both inevitable and that it would continue on more or less straight line. Now the discourse is, of course, on the return, the apparent return of religion, mainly, of course, Islam. So now we have title pages on Mecca, Deutschland, die stille Islamisierung, another great mythical Spiegel title page. This, of course, raises the question, okay, so if religion returns, is it the same religion that it was before? Can it even be called religion? Can we apply the same definition of religion? Or is this a return with a difference? In an email by, sent to us by an English publisher of a small press, Malcolm Green, Malcolm Green argued that perhaps one should differentiate between religion and religiosity, that perhaps the issue now is more one of religiosity, which he defined as more bricolage and belief, rather than simple church attendance and bowing to the Pope. So bricolage and belief, and of course we are all familiar with reports on how people kind of assemble their own religion by browsing websites online, and how they sometimes radicalize, how they develop a completely different version of, for instance, Islam, a version that's completely different from their parents, based on visits to certain websites. So religion and religiosity, how does religion change? And what does this tell us about the dynamic, the dialectic of religion and secularization? Is this return of religion, which may be religiosity, in fact part of the process of secularization? Is this new religion, this returned religion with a difference, perhaps secular to an unprecedented degree, dominated by secular concerns of identity, of post-colonial politics? And one could also make this point for previous historical periods, not just for the present. If religion is indeed part of a process of secularization, one might also say conversely that apparently secular forms of critique and of theory never completely freed themselves from their roots in religion. Left-wing discourse, Marxian discourse is scarcely thinkable without roots in Judeo-Christian religion and theology. And of course, one could use this as a weapon to attack these forms of theory, these forms of critique. They're insufficiently secular, they're really only religion in disguise, but one may as well embrace these links and come to accept that no form of discourse can be completely secularized, and it is not a matter of creating a tabula rasa. One should not strive for an abstract negation, to use a Hegelian term, but one should come to terms with these elements from history, from religious history, and try to use them in a critical and productive way. This is why in the second part of the exhibition that can now be seen at BAC and the Centraal Museum, the part at the Centraal Museum, there are really not that many explicitly religious elements, to the puzzlement, it seems, of some people. So we have a picture of Alan Greenspan rather than a picture of the Pope, and we have all kinds of things relating to contemporary visual culture, spectacle, capitalism, and to its contestation, but very little in the way of direct religious iconography. And to me, this is really important, and this, I think, really differentiates this exhibition and this project from some other exhibitions and some other projects. We shouldn't fetishize religion, put it in some box as a separate entity that's distinct from our normal secular life, our secular society. To go beyond this kind of simplistic division is precisely the point of the project. And in the second part, both contemporary society, contemporary capitalism, and forms of critique, dissent, contestation are linked back to this religious background. To finish, as I already announced, I want to show you a little clip by that great contemporary thinker Stephen Colbert on market religion, and after that the floor is Kenan Malik's. So here's Mr. Stephen Colbert.
We all won today, folks. The House rejected the $700 billion bailout bill. Woo! Thanks, but no thanks on that bailout to nowhere. Na 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 na, na 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 na. Hey, goodbye. House Republicans sent a strong message that Wall Street fat cats are not getting a handout, just tax cuts forever. Of course, the supporters of this bill wouldn't shut up about how this is the end of the world.
If we defeat this bill today, it will be a very bad day for the financial sector of the American economy.
Ooh, I'm scared. Barney Frank wouldn't know a bad day for the economy if we're 3 feet behind him dancing disco. But I tell you what, I will say this for Representative Frank. When he smells a national crisis, he will do whatever it takes to get things done.
I'm ready to work. I mean, as a practical matter, tomorrow Wednesday being Rosh Hashanah, I will not be available for government work.
Oh, no. Rosh Hashanah. Too bad. If only this were Hanukkah, the credit markets would last another 8 days. Of course, when this misguided bailout was ultimately rejected, the stock market reacted with confidence by, let me just check this out, by plummeting 777 points, the largest point drop in history. Let's put that away. Put that in my bindle. Gotta remember to barter that laptop for some baked beans. So just why did a free market president like Bush propose a government bailout in the first place? His answer was disappointing.
The market is not functioning properly.
Mr. President, I respectfully disagree. The market is fine. We are the ones who are not functioning properly. Which brings us to tonight's word. Ye of little faith. Now, folks, everyone seems to have forgotten that the free market is not just some economic theory we can abandon when things get rough. It requires faith.
I'm a capitalist. I believe in the free market.
And I believe so strongly in the principles of the free market.
I believe in the free market.
We either believe in the free market system or we do not.
It is a lot like believing in another all-powerful being. God. You see, like God, the market is all around us. And folks, the market guides us. It guides us with an invisible hand. Now, God inspires towering steeples. The market, towering skyscrapers. Both God and the market, evidently, both compensating for something. And like God, if we have faith in it, the free market is the answer to all our problems. But if we doubt it, it will withhold its precious gifts. Now, some out there, folks, are going to say that this financial meltdown shows the market is fallible, that it is, in fact, not God. Well, I will tell you, it does not mean that the market is not God. It means that the market is just a dangerous and destructive God. Think of the Old Testament. Look at Job. Job was riding high. A lot of Job fans here tonight. Job was riding high on a big livestock and children bubble before that burst. He lost everything, but he stayed faithful to God and got back even more than he lost. Or, now that I think of it, maybe the market isn't like the Judeo-Christian God at all. It might be a blindly vengeful God with 1,000 hungry mouths who comes in the form of a winged serpent to destroy the universe with a black flame. It would make sense. It would make sense that the market's some ancient god of wrath. After all, the high priests who enter the Holy of Holies clearly go mad.
He's nuts! They're nuts! They do nothing!
My point is, hear me, O children of capitalism. Thou shalt not abandon thy one true God for the false idols of socialism. That way lies eternal damnation. We must believe even harder. Our God demands sacrifice. And I don't mean regulation, I mean human flesh. Hell! We already threw Lehman Brothers into the mouth of the beast. Then it ate AIG, and it ate WAMU, and it ate Wachovia. It's gobbling Wall Street firm by firm, and it's still hungry. I say we feed it Main Street. Being eaten alive by the market is better than admitting the government should have any role. So everybody, calm down. There is nothing that we can do now. Thanks to the House Republicans, we are in the market's hands. And it will take care of us, only if we trust it. Oh, ye of little faith. And that's the word. We'll be right back.